No matter what I do in life, no matter how much good I've done, some people is gonna look at my case, they're gonna look at my past, and I'm always gonna be the monster that they think that I am. And no, I'm not a monster. I've never been a monster. I've been hearing I was crazy all my life. I used to get angry, pissed off. I don't think like that anymore. I just roll with it.
I think we could all be dangerous people.
People say you're a monster.
I'm not sitting here saying I'm innocent.
I just murdered some guy in cold blood.
When I committed my crime, when I did what I did, I felt nothing. It didn't bother me. I just remember thinking, I just killed somebody. It's not that big of a deal. It's just a body. At first, I thought I just had one victim. And then I realized that I got a whole slew of victims. I was born in Logansport, Indiana. Oh, I guess you could say times were great back then. I remember me and my brothers, we was really close. I have an older brother named Larry, and then I have a little brother named Doug. Wherever one of us was at, all three of us was together, and if one of us got in trouble, my mother knew that the other two was involved, whether she caught us or not. We always tried to lie for each other. We tried to protect each other. We was bonded pretty well. When we moved to Texas, it's pretty much when my mom fell apart. Back in the 80s, I think she was a great mother. She was joyful, she was happy. But it was like when she lost my older brother, then she lost everything. And things just kind of spiraled out of control. She fell into drugs, alcohol. She took it really bad. There was never any food in the house. Most of the time we had no running water. We had no electricity, no heat during the winter. There pretty much, the abandonments came along. She would disappear for days, sometimes weeks at a time. I guess you could say I was the one that took it the worst. I didn't care that we didn't have no food. I didn't care about anything. I just wanted my mother to love me. And she always seemed like she loved everybody else more than she did me. We was probably back here in Indiana, probably about 4 months. My mom did what she always did. She up and disappeared. Left me and my little brother with my father. All I can tell you about my father is that he worked on the railroad for almost 10 years. He and he was an alcoholic. He was an abusive prick is what he was. And he started getting abusive, started getting violent, mostly towards me. I tried to bond with him, but I don't know. He always looked at me different. He always treated me different. Everything that he did to me, he blamed my mother for it. He would always beat the shit out of me and then say it was my mother's fault. I always wanted to be good. I always wanted to do good. But for some reason I was just, well, I know why. I was just angry, pissed off. If I needed an escape, I'd go to my grandmother's. The relationship with my grandmother was actually, I would say, exceptional. She was a really great woman. She was always in a great mood. She was always perky, always excited, always happy to see me. She was my safe haven. She was my barrier between me and everybody. My late teens, early 20s was like, I want to say they were really great, but they were bad at the same time. I ended up falling into drugs. And then started out smoking pot like a lot of people. And I was a pretty avid cokehead. I'd smoke crack every now and then, ate a lot of mushrooms, acid. It didn't solve any of my problems. It didn't make any things better. All it did is that it just made me not care. And the more I didn't care, then the easier it was to deal with things, the easier it was to cope. From about 23 and on, it was really inconsistent. All my friends, my brothers, everybody had their kids, they had their wives, they had their friends, and here I was still the bachelor. My life became nothing but about drugs and alcohol. I had no food in my house. I felt it was like being in my childhood again. I didn't pay my bills. I stayed consistent. I stayed fucked up. I thought everybody was out to get me. If I saw somebody wave at me or if I saw somebody peeping out the windows, I would think that they was plotting on me. My mindset at the time was that I need to go kill this motherfucker and everybody that's in that house before he comes over and kills me. My drugs, my alcohol was just taking over. That day started out like any other. I was sitting around smoking pot, and I started thinking about everything that was done to me. The beatings, the abandonments, how my life was a failure, and it set me off. Just this rage that I couldn't control. I popped open the Xanax and started chewing on them, and I was trying to calm down. So I start chugging beers, trying to smoke weed, or I was smoking weed, and nothing seemed to be working. I don't remember what other fucking pills I ended up chewing on, but I was just getting madder and I was getting worse. The rage and the hate that was in me that was coming out, it was, I don't know, but I felt like everything that was going wrong in my life was because of my past, and my past was because of my family. I don't remember what happened, but I ended up dipping out. And I took off heading towards my dad's house. And I was gonna go kill my father. I came to that fork in the road, and as hard as I tried to go right, something was steering me left, and then I realized that I need to go to my safe haven, my grandmother's house. Because if I go to my grandma's, I'll see my grandma, everything will be fine, I'll mellow out. Nothing ever bad happens there. It's my neutral grounds. Oh, fuck. This is where it's gonna get bad. Oh, man. That poor woman, fucking. When I first walked in the door, she was excited to see me, and I was fucked up. Man, I mean, I don't know how I was functional. I remember it was around 11:30 midnight when I looked at the clock, and I was coming out of the bathroom. I don't know if I opened the door too fast or if I opened it too hard, but I know that I scared her. The rage just hit instantly. We made eye contact, and I remember thinking that I have to kill her. She's got to die, and she's going to be my first. Next thing I know, there was a pair of shearing scissors in my right hand. She never stood a chance. I stood there and watched her until I knew she was dead. And I looked at her, and I remember thinking, well, I can't leave her laying on the floor. So I scooped her up and I carried her to bed, and then I laid her in her bed and I wrapped her up in her blanket. This is where it gets a little weird, but I don't know why I did this weird shit either, but I climbed in bed with her, and then I grabbed her arm and I pulled her arm over me, and I snuggled up next to her body and went to sleep.
This was the most bizarre case that I had ever been involved in my 35 years of law enforcement. My name's Catherine Collins. I was a detective lieutenant with the Logansport Police Department. I ultimately conducted the interview of Mr. Groves at the Cass County Jail. As soon as we walked into that interview room, the first thing that he said to us was, "You didn't disturb Grandma, did you?" And we both felt that that was rather odd. And then he started talking, and it was almost like a struggle for him to even stop.
When I opened up that door, she was there, and I just grabbed a hold of her and went fucking crazy on her.
Okay.
I couldn't stop it. I couldn't control myself. It's kind of like where you're standing outside your body and you're watching yourself do something. I'm fucking remember thinking, why can't you stop?
It was really strange that we had somebody that literally was pouring his guts out to us about what he had done, and we hadn't even had a chance to investigate it yet. We looked at each other when he started talking, and it's like, this guy's nuts.
I don't know. I just wanted to hurt somebody, I guess. I'm not all there in the head, and I know it. I need to see a psychiatrist or a shrink. Fuck it. Too late now, huh?
He told us all kinds of information in regards to what had happened. However, he couldn't provide us with a reason why he did it. We absolutely knew that we were dealing with somebody with a mental health issue. We absolutely knew that.
I kept thinking there, shots running through my head. This is fucked up. I just killed my grandma. I don't have one bit of fucking sympathy, sorrow, no emotion, nothing. You know my grandma? She was the last of the elders, of all my old elders.
Was she?
And I killed her.
We just don't typically interview somebody that seemed like they almost enjoyed saying what they were saying. And then it got even more bizarre.
Remember after I killed her, or I'm out to killing and every motherfucker I could get my hands on, because I want to go out and start picking motherfuckers off.
He was able to tell us that after he had killed his grandmother, that his next intention the following morning was he was going to go to his father's house and murder his father.
When I left Grandma's, I went and got me some cigarettes and headed straight for my dad's, and I was going to go smack him over the head. I was going to bash his head with a ball-peen hammer.
You just don't ever want to think bad about somebody that was so close to you. It just makes you question everything. We always had a close relationship. Rex was always there. All we had to do was call, and he would be there. I am Courtney, and I am Rex's niece. My uncle is 15 years older than I am. When we were in school, we would always want him to pick us up because he had the big Dodge truck, and he always blared Eminem. And to us at the time, we thought it was cool, and all the kids loved him because he was always fun. He always joked around. I mean, he was my everything. He was my world at the time. This house right here is where we lived at, where Rex came to that day. My mom was at home. She knew something was going on because he wouldn't stop. He was pacing and he started, talking crazy. He said that he killed somebody. She didn't believe that's what actually happened, but she didn't know what else to do. And he just had her take him to the police station, and that's when they found out he did commit the crime that he said he did. And that is when it came out that his intentions were that he came to our house to, kill our family. Makes you think about a lot, makes you question a lot. That day could have went a lot different. How could somebody go from loving you and doing anything for you to saying that they were going to intentionally kill you? I talked to him just the day before it happened, and we just had a regular conversation. There was no signs that would make me think, something's about to happen. Nothing was wrong.
No part of it makes sense. As a child, he was just as normal as me and you were. My name is Douglas Groves, and my older brother is Rex Groves. We were best friends, always together, always exploring. A lot of love. Yeah, we had a great time growing up. Besides, the things that make it not so great, you know what I mean? My father was definitely abusive. Blackout drunk shit, My mom's the same way. It was hard, especially for Rex. That was kind of something that I don't think most kids our age were dealing with. You know what I mean? What transpired in Texas was, as you would say, the catalyst for the end result of this. There was a time, and I can't say what age we were staying at my mom's friend's. My mom was dating this guy. At one point, that old man ends up in the room laying on the other side of my brother. And he touched my brother. He was laying right beside me. I would definitely call it molestation given what I know now. Rex never talked about it with anybody. I told my mom, but my mom was so convinced that this guy wasn't a fucking child molester. She actually stayed with this pervert, we'll say. I don't know how long after that the abuse that my brother was dealing with went on. It could have been a week, could have been 6 months. Oh, man. It's hard because, You don't ever want to see somebody you love deal with something like that. I believe 100% that if that would have never happened, he'd be right here. After we'd moved back to Indiana, I started seeing the changes. Rex was probably about 13, 14, 15, somewhere around there. And the weirdness started coming along. He said, bro, I've got these voices in my head that are telling me to do bad shit, to hurt somebody. I would say, that's just your conscience, bro. We all have it. You're not any more crazier than the people that live next door. You know what I mean? Over the years, I started to see a decline with the normal Rex. He wasn't the same old brother that I had growing up. I really feel like there was a mental disconnect. I think this is all stemmed from the abuse, the molesting. I didn't deal with that shit, and I didn't murder anybody. You know what I mean? He dealt with it, and he murdered somebody.
Doctors sometimes come to different conclusions, and if I may, should come to different conclusions based on seeing people at different times. I reviewed the other doctor's report, and his diagnostic impression was schizophrenia paranoid type. But I did not come to that conclusion. I did not see enough clear, consistent evidence of psychosis. I'm Dr. Don Olive. I was appointed by the Cass County Superior Court in the state of Indiana to complete a competency and sanity evaluation on the defendant, Mr. Rex Groves. When friends understandably say they think the person is insane, I'll say something like, I know what you mean, but not necessarily so, legally speaking. Insanity is a legal concept, not a clinical concept. When I met with Mr. Groves, I didn't see any evidence of, for example, psychosis, delusions or hallucinations that may have rendered him legally insane at the time of the offense and unable to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct, which is the way insanity is defined in the state of Indiana. More broadly, he was just full of rage, right? Angry at himself, angry at the world. Nobody loves me. I'm this hated, unloved person. So for that, among other reasons, I diagnosed him with features of personality disorder, namely antisocial and borderline personality disorder. And when you look at that diagnostic history combined with disinhibiting drugs, to me it's like adding gasoline to a fire. But this appears to be, however horrendous, a fairly isolated event in terms of the severity, lethality of his offense. So, in my opinion, he was not legally insane at the time. Once a person is convicted and is sentenced to prison, they have access to mental health treatment. I believe that if Rex commits himself to that, he could potentially do relatively well when released, because the vast majority of these folks, sooner or later, will be released.
Rex was sentenced to 50 years in the Indiana Department of Corrections. But unless he commits another crime while in prison, Rex only has to do around half of that time. When he gets to that threshold, there's nothing anybody can do to stop him from being released, and that includes the parole board or anybody else who might be concerned about the fact that he's not quite ready to get out. He's going to get out. My name is Brad Rosie, and I'm a local attorney. I was assigned to represent Rex Groves in this murder case. I'm very concerned about what his mental state will be when he walks out of that facility, because when you're somebody who has deep-rooted psychiatric problems and you're capable of doing something as heinous as what he did, and then you go spend 15 or 20 years in a prison, I can assure you the chances of you having the clear mind, an entirely clear mind, that in and of itself is extremely unlikely. I'm not taking a shot at the prison officials, but the circumstances and the environment that they're in is not conducive to therapy. And, you know, it's frustrating because I have never seen a more compelling case for an insanity plea that's ever landed in this office. And we've been around for 115 years.
When I came to prison, they had me on some pretty heavy antipsychotics. They put me on them because they diagnosed me as being bipolar, anger, suffering from depression, antisociopath, paranoid schizophrenia. What else was there? Possible multiple personality disorder. But I quit taking medications about a year into my incarceration. And then I've been off the medications ever since. And I'm super psyched and amped. I'm excited to get out of prison. I feel really great about myself personally. Don't get me wrong, I still get angry every now and then, but when I catch myself, I've learned breathing techniques, I've learned coping mechanisms. I believe that I'm more than ready for society. I just, I don't know if my family is ready for me.
Well, it is terrifying. If that second evaluation would have been a little stronger in favor of incompetence, I think that Rex would have ended up in a mental health institution where his treatment undoubtedly would have been more focused and of a higher quality than what he's had. The psychiatric staff and the medical staff changes routinely in places like that, so the idea that someone's on and off medication is not surprising at all. But if he were on some other type of court order commitment in the mental health facility, there would have to be some results generated to show that he's no longer crazy, essentially, before he could leave there. And the concern is, will he hurt somebody when he gets out? That very well could happen. That's what's scary about his release.
He's written me several times, and I've never read any of the letters. I just cut him off. And it's a fucking horrible excuse, but I got wrapped up in life. I miss him a lot, but I want to see my brother be who he was. You know, and the reality is he probably never will be. The last time I saw Rex was right after he was convicted. I remember sitting there thinking what I seen in his eyes was not my brother. And what I mean by that is they're almost solid black, almost as if he's possessed. I thought, he has the Charles Manson look on his face. He was gone mentally. And I remember thinking, I don't know that I'll be coming back to see you. I would have much rather seen him go to a mental institution than to prison. I believe he didn't get the help he needed initially, and I don't know that he's gotten it now.
His letters are always short and sweet. Hey, Runt, how's life on the outside? Good, I hope. Things in here have not changed a bit. People come and people go. That's jail for you. Thought would drop a line and say, hey, so hey. Love always, Uncle Rex. XOXO. The first letter I got was October 10th of 2008. I think at the time it was kind of helped with the coping mechanism of it, to help keep contact, to try to fill in some of the blanks as to why it happened, like why he did it. I've asked him, but he avoids the question. The only thing he says is drugs and alcohol. As far as would I trust seeing him, you know, out of prison, I honestly don't know. I have visited him. I was comfortable there. I was okay there because I knew, you know, nothing could happen. In several of his letters, he's mentioned that, you know, he's done the drug and alcohol classes. He said he's went to therapy, he's completed it, he's done this and he's done that, but has he did all that to make himself look good in prison? Rex has always been a talker. He can tell you anything and make you believe it. But nobody's really gonna know if he's reformed or, you know, the change is good until he is released, until he's back in society. It's a hard decision because on one hand you want to see him do good, you want to see him get out of prison and, you know, reform to life and society and make something of himself. But then on the other hand, you don't want him free, you don't want him out because you don't want to take the chance of, you know, it happening again. And if he does, do I want to be close enough to where I could be, you know, the next victim? So I think that definitely plays a big role in the fear of ever having a relationship with him outside of prison, because you don't know. We didn't see it coming then. What's to say if he does it again, we're going to see it coming then?
I'm scared to get out. I'm not gonna lie. What if it happens again? What if it could happen again? What if I can't get the help that I need at that one moment in time and I turn around and freak the fuck out? There's always going to be the what if factors. The question is how am I going to deal with it?
When you're somebody who has deep-rooted psychiatric problems, and then you go spend 15 or 20 years in a prison, I can assure you, the chances of you having the clear mind, an entirely clear mind, that in and of itself is extremely unlikely. If that second evaluation would have been a little stronger in favor of incompetence, I think that Rex would have ended up in a mental health institution where his treatment undoubtedly would have been more focused and of a higher quality than what he's had.
It definitely wouldn't hurt to probably send me to a mental institution. I probably would have got cured a lot faster. Oh, I'll definitely admit I have paranoid schizophrenia. Yeah, there's no doubt to that. It's just I have more control over it now. I don't need medications to tell me or to calm me down. And I'd say I probably got rid of the voices. Everything probably mellowed out around 2015.
The last time I saw my brother was right after he was convicted. I remember sitting there thinking what I seen in his eyes was not my brother. Almost as if he's possessed. I thought, he has the Charles Manson look on his face. He was gone. Mentally.
Yeah, it's, well, yeah. He's half right, half wrong. One thing is that when I got sentenced, I was on heavy antipsychotics. Those meds had me zombified. But, I mean, I understand the whole insanity, the psychotic break, psychotic episode. I guess you could say I'm in denial of it. I don't want to be known as the fruitcake. The difference between me today and the difference between me back then is that I got resources now. And I'm doing everything that I can to make sure that people feel safe and secure when I get out.
Did you have urges to hurt your family in the years after this crime?
Oh, yeah. I don't mean to laugh. It's not funny. It's my coping mechanism. At the time, that was my regret. That was my only regret, is that I didn't finish what I started. I hated myself that I didn't fucking get all of them. But last time I wanted to hurt any of my family was, I want to say, around 2015. I say it took me a long time to actually get over a lot of things. I mean, I understand. They have every right to be scared of me. If it was the other way around, I'd feel the same way. I'm not blaming them, but you're still supposed to be my family. I just wish you guys would talk to me. Give me a chance. Anything. And that's about all I could say.
There are crimes that shock a city for a season. There are crimes that dominate headlines for a year. And then there are the rare cases that refuse to disappear, lingering in police archives like unfinished sentences, haunting detectives who inherit yellowing files from the generation before them, whispering through evidence, rooms where every sealed envelope carries the weight of unanswered questions. The murder of Carla Walker became one of those cases. It was the kind of investigation that convinced people a perfect crime might actually exist. A young woman vanished within seconds. A killer disappeared into the darkness without leaving a name behind. Witnesses had almost nothing. Detectives chased shadows. Families waited through birthdays, holidays, and decades of silence. As the years passed, the mystery hardened into legend. Children who had not even been born when Carla died grew into adults hearing stories about the cold case that nobody believed would ever be solved. Yet hidden inside a tiny fragment of forgotten evidence lay a truth that had been waiting patiently since the night everything changed. The killer believed time had erased every trace of his existence. He was wrong. Fort Worth, Texas. February 17th, still 1974. Winter had settled gently across the city, bringing cool evening air instead of bitter cold. Teenagers gathered at restaurants, movie theaters, and school events, filling parking lots with laughter and music pouring from car radios. For 18-year-old Carla Walker, it was supposed to be another ordinary Sunday night. Yet she had spent the evening with her boyfriend, Rodney McCoy. Like countless young couples, they lingered together after a Valentine's dance, reluctant to let the night end. Nothing about those final moments suggested danger. Nothing hinted that they were being watched. The parking lot appeared quiet. The surrounding streets seemed empty. Every detail looked painfully ordinary. It is often that way. The most devastating crimes rarely announce themselves. They arrive without warning, without preparation, without mercy. Rodney parked his car near the bowling alley. The conversation continued naturally. Plans for tomorrow. Small jokes. The comfortable silence shared only by two people who believed they had all the time in the world. Then everything changed. Without warning, a violent stranger appeared beside the vehicle. A handgun shattered the illusion of safety in a single instant. The attack unfolded so quickly that memory itself struggled to keep pace. The armed man ordered Rodney out of the car. Confusion became terror. Rodney resisted. A desperate struggle erupted in the darkness. The attacker struck him repeatedly with the weapon. Metal slammed against bone. Blood poured from Rodney's head. The gunman forced him toward the ground. Everything happened within seconds. Carla screamed. Rodney fought despite overwhelming odds. He knew exactly what was happening. The stranger was trying to take her. He refused to surrender. Even while dazed from repeated blows, he continued struggling. The attacker responded with brutal violence. Another strike. Another. Rodney's vision blurred. His strength disappeared. The world narrowed into flashes of pain and desperate instinct. Then came the sound he would remember for the rest of his life. Car tires spinning violently against pavement. An engine roaring into the night. Silence. When Rodney managed to regain enough awareness to stand, the car was gone. Carla was gone. The attacker had vanished as though swallowed by darkness itself. Moments earlier, two teenagers had been preparing to say goodnight. Now one remained alone inside a nightmare that would define the rest of his life. Police arrived quickly. Emergency lights transformed the quiet parking lot into organized chaos. Officers questioned Rodney while paramedics treated his injuries. He described the attacker as best he could. Male. Armed. Violent. Everything had happened too quickly. The darkness concealed crucial details. Fear distorted memory. Investigators immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation. This was no ordinary missing person report. It was an abduction. Every passing minute reduced the chances of finding Carla alive. Radio broadcasts spread rapidly across neighboring jurisdictions. Roadblocks were considered. Patrol officers searched highways leading away from Fort Worth. Nearby fields. Industrial areas. Abandoned properties. Nothing. The city seemed to absorb both victim and offender without leaving visible tracks. Hours passed. Then morning arrived. Hope began giving way to dread. Search teams expanded. Volunteers joined officers examining isolated roads, drainage ditches, wooded areas, and open lands surrounding the city. Everyone understood the unspoken reality. Kidnapping cases involving unknown offenders often end in tragedy. Still, no one wanted to say the words aloud. They searched anyway. Every mile carried possibility. Every shadow invited another look. Late the following day, the search ended. Carla Walker's body was discovered in a secluded area not far from where she had disappeared. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been murdered. The brutality stunned even experienced investigators. Fort Worth awakened to devastating headlines. A teenager abducted almost directly from beside her boyfriend. A killer escaping into the night without leaving an obvious trail. Parents throughout the city reacted immediately. Curfews tightened. Young couples reconsidered late-night plans. Ordinary parking lots suddenly felt dangerous. Fear spread faster than facts. Rumors multiplied. Everyone seemed to know someone who claimed to possess new information. Most of it proved worthless. Investigators established an extensive crime scene. Every inch of ground received careful examination. Photographs documented every detail. Evidence technicians collected fibers, biological samples, footwear impressions, hair, anything capable of preserving the identity of the unknown killer. In 1974, forensic science remained limited compared with future decades. DNA testing did not yet exist. Computers played virtually no role in homicide investigations. Everything depended upon physical evidence, witness interviews, fingerprints, and relentless detective work. Experienced investigators believed every crime contained a mistake. The challenge was finding it. Detectives interviewed Rodney repeatedly. His account remained consistent despite overwhelming trauma. He described the attack, the struggle, the gun, the speed. He desperately wished he had seen more, remembered more, done more. Like countless surviving witnesses, he blamed himself for circumstances no reasonable person could have controlled. The guilt became its own lifelong sentence. Investigators assured him repeatedly he had fought. He had resisted. He had nearly been killed himself. Nothing suggested he could have stopped the abduction. Logic rarely defeats survivors' guilt. Rodney continued, replaying those final moments for years, searching his memory for details that refused to appear. The investigation expanded rapidly. Police examined recently released offenders, known sexual predators, violent criminals operating throughout North Texas. Thousands of tips flooded the department. Every anonymous phone call generated fresh hope. Every promising lead dissolved into disappointment. Sketch artists worked with Rodney to create a composite image. The drawing appeared in newspapers across Texas. Television stations interrupted programming with updates. Reward money increased. Community meetings attracted frightened residents demanding answers. The pressure mounted. City officials wanted results. Families wanted justice. The public wanted reassurance that a predator was not roaming freely through Fort Worth. Detectives worked around the clock. Every interview produced another possibility, another suspect, another dead end. The crime itself presented frustrating contradictions. The attack appeared planned. The offender displayed confidence. He acted with extraordinary speed. Yet investigators found no convincing evidence that Carla herself had been specifically targeted. Was she chosen at random? Had the killer been watching young couples that evening? Did he arrive intending to commit violence against whoever happened to be alone? Or had Carla unknowingly crossed paths with someone who had become dangerously obsessed? Every theory remained possible. None could be proven. As weeks became months, frustration deepened. Laboratories analyzed every available piece of physical evidence using the best technology of the era. Some findings proved useful. Others raised additional questions. Tiny hairs recovered during the investigation attracted attention. Fibers suggested contact between victim and offender. Biological evidence existed. Unfortunately, science had not yet developed the ability to identify individuals through genetic analysis. Investigators preserved everything carefully, not because they foresaw DNA technology, because experienced detectives understood a timeless principle. Evidence should outlive assumptions. What appears meaningless today may become decisive tomorrow. Without realizing it, they were preserving the future. Meanwhile, life continued outside the investigation. Schools reopened. Businesses operated normally. New crimes demanded police attention. News headlines shifted. Only the Walker family remained permanently frozen in February 1974. Birthdays became memorials. Holidays carried unbearable absence. Every family photograph reminded them of a future that had vanished forever inside a dark parking lot. Detectives shared that burden. Cold cases rarely begin as cold cases. They begin with determination, energy, confidence. No investigator believes an investigation destined to remain unsolved. Yet each unsuccessful month slowly transforms certainty into uncertainty. Questions multiply faster than answers. Witnesses forget. Evidence reaches technological limits. Suspects disappear. The Walker investigation entered that dangerous territory. Not abandoned. Never forgotten. Simply trapped. Waiting for something no detective in 1974 could possibly imagine. Years later, veteran investigators would often return to one haunting thought. The killer had almost certainly believed he committed the perfect crime. No identification. No confession. No eyewitness capable of recognizing him. No forensic technology advanced enough to expose him. He disappeared back into ordinary life while an entire city searched in vain. For decades, that belief appeared justified. The case gathered dust inside evidence storage. Detectives retired. New investigators inherited the file. Fresh theories emerged. Old suspects were eliminated. Still, the murderer remained invisible. But inside one carefully preserved evidence envelope, untouched by the passing years, rested something so small that no one in 1974 could fully appreciate its significance. A microscopic trace. Silent. Forgotten. Patient. Waiting for science to become powerful enough to reveal the name of the man who believed 40 years of silence had buried his crime forever. The first 48 hours after a violent abduction are often described as the most critical period of any homicide investigation. Witnesses still remember faces. Tire tracks remain visible before weather erases them. Physical evidence has not yet been disturbed. Every passing hour narrows the path leading toward the offender. Detectives working the murder of Carla Walker understood that reality better than anyone. They knew the investigation stood at a crossroads. Either they would identify the man responsible quickly, or they risked chasing a ghost for years. They refused to believe the second outcome was possible. They had a victim, a surviving witness, a crime scene, and a city determined to help. What they did not know was that the man they were searching for had already disappeared back into ordinary life, carrying with him the confidence that no one had seen enough to recognize him. The crime scene became the center of an enormous investigative effort. Officers sealed the isolated location where Carla's body had been discovered. Photographers documented every angle. Evidence technicians moved methodically across the ground, searching for anything that might establish the killer's identity. Every footprint mattered. Every tire impression received careful examination. Loose fibers were collected. Vegetation was examined for broken branches or disturbed soil. Nothing was considered too small. Experienced homicide investigators often repeat the same lesson. People lie. Evidence rarely does. The body itself revealed a devastating sequence of violence. Medical examiners worked carefully to establish the timeline. They documented injuries, collected biological samples, preserved trace evidence. Every observation became another piece of a puzzle that still lacked its most important component: a name. Investigators reconstructed Carla's final hours with extraordinary precision. The Valentine's dance, the drive afterward, the stop at the bowling alley parking lot, the quiet conversation inside the vehicle, the sudden appearance of an armed stranger. Rodney McCoy became the investigation's most important witness. He also became one of its greatest victims. The physical injuries eventually healed. The emotional wounds never truly would. Detectives interviewed him repeatedly, not because they doubted his honesty, but because trauma often buries details beneath shock. A memory overlooked during the first interview sometimes resurfaces days later. A sound, a phrase, a movement. Anything could matter. Rodney remained remarkably consistent. The attacker had acted quickly. He carried a handgun. He struck with overwhelming force. He spoke with confidence. Everything suggested experience rather than panic. One detail especially troubled investigators. The offender appeared completely in control from the very beginning. He never hesitated. He never seemed uncertain. His movements were deliberate, calculated, almost practiced. That observation led detectives toward an unsettling possibility. Perhaps this was not his first violent crime. Investigators expanded their search beyond Fort Worth. Police departments across Texas received bulletins describing the attack. Known sexual offenders became immediate priorities. Men with histories of violent assaults were questioned. Parole records were reviewed. Vehicles matching general descriptions were investigated. Every possible lead generated another series of interviews. Most ended exactly the same way. Nothing connected. Nothing explained how a young woman could disappear from beside her boyfriend in seconds and seemingly vanish without leaving a trail. Public fear intensified. Parents who once allowed teenagers to stay out late suddenly imposed strict curfews. Dating habits changed. Parking lots emptied earlier than usual. Ordinary places acquired an unfamiliar sense of danger. The murder had shattered an assumption many people never realized they carried. That violence happened somewhere else. Not here. Not in familiar neighborhoods. Not to ordinary families. Carla Walker's death destroyed that illusion overnight. The media followed every development. Newspapers published detailed timelines. Television reporters stood outside police headquarters waiting for updates that rarely came. Reward money increased as investigators appealed directly to the public. Someone, they believed, had to recognize the suspect. Someone had seen something unusual. Someone knew a man whose behavior changed after February 17, SIL 1974. Every appeal produced another flood of telephone calls. Thousands of names reached investigators. Some tips appeared promising. Others bordered on the unbelievable. Detectives chased them all. A man seen washing blood from his vehicle. A stranger behaving nervously inside a local diner. An acquaintance suddenly leaving town. Anonymous callers claimed to know the killer. Psychics insisted they had visions. Letters arrived offering impossible theories. Hope rose and collapsed almost daily. Meanwhile, forensic laboratories examined every piece of physical evidence using the best techniques available. Hair comparisons, fiber analysis, blood typing, microscopic examination. Each represented cutting-edge science for the era. Each also carried frustrating limitations. Analysts could often exclude suspects. Rarely could they identify one conclusively. The biological evidence recovered from Carla's body represented tremendous potential. Unfortunately, potential is not proof. Not in 1974. DNA profiling would not become available for another decade, and it would take many more years before it transformed criminal investigations worldwide. The evidence existed. Science simply could not yet hear what it was trying to say. Detectives began constructing behavioral profiles based upon the crime itself. The offender demonstrated confidence under pressure. He controlled two victims simultaneously. He assaulted Rodney with brutal efficiency. He abducted Carla rapidly despite the obvious risk of witnesses. Those characteristics suggested someone comfortable with violence. Someone capable of making immediate decisions. Someone willing to gamble everything for complete control over another human being. The profile narrowed possibilities without identifying anyone specifically. It painted a psychological portrait rather than a physical face. Months passed. The investigation remained active. Case files expanded into towering stacks of reports. Interview transcripts filled filing cabinets. Maps covered office walls. Colored pins marked sightings, tips, suspect addresses, and potential routes traveled after the abduction. Every new theory required another round of verification. Every verification consumed valuable time. Eventually, patterns began emerging. Not patterns pointing toward the offender. Patterns revealing the investigation's greatest obstacle. Too many possibilities. Too little certainty. One particularly frustrating reality haunted detectives. The attacker had selected darkness as an accomplice. Rodney's opportunity to observe him lasted only moments. Stress narrowed perception. Violence distorted memory. Investigators could assemble a general description, but nothing distinctive enough to identify a stranger among thousands of men living in North Texas. Without fingerprints. Without a confession. Without a recognizable suspect. The case drifted toward dangerous territory. Cold territory. Inside the Walker household, however, nothing grew cold. Carla's family continued searching for answers every single day. Friends described an unbearable silence replacing the laughter that once filled ordinary family gatherings. Her bedroom remained a place suspended in time. Photographs became sacred objects. Every anniversary reopened wounds that never fully healed. Unlike police departments balancing dozens of investigations simultaneously, families never move on to another case. For them, there is only one. Detectives understood that burden. Many formed personal connections with the Walker family. Promises were made. The investigation would continue, no matter how long it required. Those promises became increasingly difficult to keep as years slipped away. The original investigative team gradually changed. Retirements began. Promotions reassigned experienced personnel. New detectives inherited thousands of pages written by officers they had never met. Reading a cold case file is unlike reading any ordinary report. Each page reflects hope that once existed. Every interview documents a possibility someone genuinely believed might solve the case. Every eliminated suspect represents weeks or months of determined effort ending in disappointment. The Walker file carried all of that history. It became less an investigation than an archive of persistence. Still, one principle remained unchanged. Never destroy evidence. The biological samples collected in 1974 were carefully preserved despite their limited immediate usefulness. Some investigators questioned why so much emphasis remained on materials laboratories could not fully analyze. Veteran detectives answered with remarkable foresight. Science changes. Evidence should be ready when it does. At the time, those words sounded more like optimism than prediction. No one imagined just how dramatically forensic science would evolve over the following decades. The years rolled forward. The 1970s became the 1980s. The 1980s became the 1990s. Entire generations of police officers entered and left the profession. Computers replaced typewriters. Databases expanded. DNA revolutionized criminal investigations across the country. Cold cases once considered impossible suddenly reopened under entirely new possibilities. Inside evidence storage, the materials collected from Carla Walker waited patiently. The fibers, the biological samples, the hairs. Every carefully sealed envelope represented a message from the past addressed to a future that had not yet arrived. The killer knew nothing about those envelopes. He believed the investigation had exhausted every option. Years without an arrest became decades. Decades became confidence. Confidence became routine. He worked, lived, aged, celebrated birthdays, watched the world transform around him while believing one violent night in 1974 had disappeared forever beneath the weight of history. He had no way of knowing that the smallest trace he left behind had survived every passing year. It had remained hidden inside a secure evidence room, untouched by time, waiting for a scientific breakthrough that would eventually accomplish what generations of detectives could not. The evidence had never forgotten him. It was simply waiting for the day it could finally say his name. Cold cases do not become cold because detectives stop caring. They become cold because every available lead has been exhausted, every known witness has been questioned, every reasonable suspect has been investigated, and every scientific tool of the era has reached its limit. That was the reality facing the investigators assigned to the murder of Carla Walker. The case had never been abandoned. It had simply reached the edge of what 1974 could accomplish. Beyond that edge stretched decades of waiting. Waiting for memory to reveal something new. Waiting for someone to confess. Waiting for a mistake the killer might someday make. Waiting, without realizing it, for a revolution in forensic science that would rewrite the rules of criminal investigation forever. Inside the Fort Worth Police Department, Carla's file refused to disappear. It occupied shelves already crowded with hundreds of other investigations. But unlike many unsolved cases, it carried a special weight. Every detective knew the story. A teenage couple, a Valentine's dance, a violent abduction, a murder that unfolded almost in front of a surviving witness. The circumstances were impossible to forget. Whenever new investigators joined the homicide division, experienced officers often pointed toward the Walker case as one of the city's greatest unanswered questions. It became more than an investigation. It became unfinished business. The years passed with painful consistency. Every anniversary attracted renewed media attention. Newspaper articles revisited the crime. Television reporters interviewed detectives. The same questions returned. Was the killer still alive? Had he left Texas? Would anyone ever identify him? Each time, investigators answered with cautious determination. The case remained open. Evidence remained preserved. Hope remained alive. Behind those statements lay an uncomfortable reality. Hope was becoming increasingly difficult to justify. The investigation had generated thousands of reports. Potential suspects numbered in the hundreds. Some men voluntarily provided information. Others required formal interviews. A few appeared alarmingly plausible before evidence eliminated them. Every promising lead eventually collapsed beneath careful examination. The emotional toll extended far beyond Carla's family. Many detectives admitted years later that unsolved murders become deeply personal. Success is expected. Failure lingers. Every retirement carried the frustration of leaving behind unanswered questions. Every new detective inherited not only evidence, but responsibility. The file grew older. The promise remained the same. Find the man responsible. One question continued haunting investigators more than any other. Who commits a crime like this? Behavioral analysis in the 1970s remained limited compared with modern criminal profiling, but experienced detectives recognized patterns. The offender demonstrated boldness rarely seen in random attacks. He approached an occupied vehicle, threatened two victims simultaneously, used overwhelming violence to control resistance, abducted Carla despite enormous risks, then disappeared with remarkable efficiency. This was not impulsive behavior. It suggested planning, confidence, perhaps previous experience with violent crime. Yet every known offender matching that pattern was eventually eliminated. The investigation seemed trapped inside a contradiction. The killer appeared experienced enough to avoid capture, yet invisible enough to escape every investigative strategy. As forensic science slowly advanced during the 1980s, detectives watched with cautious optimism. DNA profiling began attracting international attention. Early cases demonstrated astonishing potential. For the first time, biological evidence could identify individuals rather than merely classify blood types or compare microscopic characteristics. The technology appeared revolutionary. It was. But revolutionary did not mean immediate. The earliest DNA methods required large, high-quality biological samples. Testing remained expensive. Laboratories were limited. Countless older cases lacked suitable evidence or sufficient preservation. Investigators examining the Walker case wondered whether the stored biological material might finally produce answers. The first evaluations offered encouragement. The evidence still existed. It had survived. Yet practical obstacles remained. Technology continued evolving. Testing standards improved. Analytical methods became more sensitive almost every year. Detectives faced a difficult decision: proceed immediately with limited capabilities, or preserve the evidence until science improved further. Patience won. It would prove one of the most important decisions in the investigation. Meanwhile, life continued for the unknown killer. Somewhere, he watched decades pass. He likely witnessed reports discussing DNA breakthroughs, high-profile convictions, gold cases suddenly solved after years of silence. Perhaps he experienced moments of private concern. Perhaps he reassured himself with a comforting belief. His crime had occurred too long ago. Too much time had passed. Too little evidence remained. No one knew his identity. He had escaped. Many violent offenders make the same dangerous assumption. They judge future investigations using the limitations of the past. History repeatedly proves them wrong. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, Fort Worth detectives periodically reopened the Walker investigation. Fresh eyes examined old reports. Evidence underwent renewed review. Previously dismissed theories returned for reconsideration. Modern investigators often notice details overlooked by earlier generations, not because previous detectives lacked skill, but because investigative perspectives evolve. Every review generated possibilities. None generated an arrest. The frustration became almost unbearable. Still, no one suggested destroying the evidence. Experienced homicide investigators understand a simple truth. Evidence ages more gracefully than memory. Witnesses forget. Documents become misplaced. Neighborhoods change. Biological evidence, if preserved correctly, remains astonishingly resilient. That resilience became the investigation's greatest ally. Outside law enforcement, Carla Walker's murder remained deeply embedded within the memory of Fort Worth. Parents who remembered the original headlines shared the story with children too young to recall the crime. Community discussions often returned to the same haunting observation. Someone had committed one of the city's most notorious murders and apparently lived freely among ordinary citizens. That thought unsettled generations. It suggested evil could hide behind routine, behind familiar faces, behind decades of apparently normal behavior. Unknown to the public, forensic laboratories were entering a new era. DNA technology advanced dramatically. Testing required increasingly smaller biological samples. Methods became more reliable. Databases expanded nationwide. Investigators who once dreamed merely of excluding suspects could now identify individuals with extraordinary precision. Then came another revolution: investigative genetic genealogy. Unlike traditional DNA databases, this approach searched for distant family relationships rather than direct matches. Instead of identifying one individual immediately, investigators could reconstruct family trees stretching across generations. One unknown DNA profile could eventually lead to an entire branch of relatives. From there, careful genealogical research narrowed possibilities until only a handful of candidates remained. To experienced detectives, the method seemed almost unbelievable. To criminals who believed decades guaranteed safety, it represented an invisible threat, unlike anything they had anticipated. The Walker investigation suddenly looked different. The preserved evidence possessed renewed importance. Not because it had changed, because science had. Laboratory specialists carefully evaluated the biological material collected in 1974. The sample remained viable, small, fragile, but usable. Every person handling the evidence understood the significance. This was no routine laboratory submission. This was one of Fort Worth's oldest unsolved murders. One opportunity, one chance to ask modern science questions impossible to ask 40 years earlier. The testing proceeded with extraordinary caution. Months of careful analysis followed. Technicians generated a DNA profile suitable for advanced investigation. For the first time since Carla Walker's murder, detectives possessed something entirely new. Not another theory, not another witness, not another anonymous tip. They possessed a scientific identity waiting to be discovered. The DNA profile entered investigative processes unavailable to previous generations. Specialists began searching for genetic relatives, distant cousins, family connections, historical records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, census information. The work demanded remarkable patience. Family trees expanded backward before branching forward again. Every relationship required verification. Every assumption required documentation. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, possibilities narrowed. Some branches ended quickly. Others produced dozens of names. Genealogists eliminated impossible candidates through age, geography, and documented family histories. Detectives followed quietly behind, preparing for the moment science would eventually point towards someone who could actually have committed the crime. After decades of uncertainty, the investigation was finally moving again. Not dramatically, not publicly, silently, methodically, like a clock beginning to tick after years of stillness. Somewhere, entirely unaware of what was unfolding inside laboratories and genealogy offices, the man responsible continued believing history had protected him. He could not see investigators reconstructing family lines. He could not hear scientists discussing DNA markers preserved since 1974. He could not imagine that a microscopic fragment left behind on the worst night of his life was patiently guiding detectives closer with every passing day. For nearly half a century, he had trusted one assumption above all others. That time destroys evidence. What he failed to understand was that sometimes time protects it until the world is finally ready to listen to the truth it has been carrying all along. For nearly half a century, the murder of Carla Walker existed in two different worlds. One was visible to everyone, a forgotten headline preserved in newspaper archives, A tragic photograph revisited every anniversary, an unsolved mystery whispered about by generations of Fort Worth residents. The other world remained almost completely invisible. It existed inside evidence lockers, forensic laboratories, and the quiet offices of detectives who refused to let the investigation disappear. While the public believed the case had fallen silent, science was preparing to speak louder than it ever had before. Somewhere inside a carefully preserved biological sample collected in 1974 was a name. It had always been there. Investigators simply needed a way to uncover it. The process moved slowly, much slower than television dramas would suggest. Investigative genetic genealogy was not magic. It was meticulous historical research guided by modern science. The DNA profile generated from the preserved evidence did not immediately reveal a suspect. Instead, it pointed toward distant relatives, people who had never heard of Carla Walker, people who had committed no crime, people whose family histories unknowingly formed the map leading investigators toward the truth. Professional genealogists began reconstructing generations of ancestry, birth records, marriage certificates, military documents, obituaries, census records. Every document became another branch extending through decades of family history. The work demanded extraordinary patience. One incorrect assumption could send the entire investigation in the wrong direction. Every relationship required independent confirmation. Every family connection demanded verification. Meanwhile, detectives prepared quietly. Unlike earlier decades, they no longer searched randomly through hundreds of possible suspects. The genealogical research gradually narrowed the field. Families became smaller. Geographic patterns emerged. Age estimates aligned with the crime. Eventually, investigators identified a cluster of individuals who deserved much closer examination. One name repeatedly returned: Glenn Samuel McCurley. To the public, he appeared unremarkable. He had lived an ordinary life, worked, raised a family, aged quietly. Nothing about his public existence reflected one of Texas's most infamous unsolved murders. Like so many offenders who escape immediate detection, he had blended into routine life with remarkable success. Nearly 50 years had passed. Few people would ever have connected him to the crime. Investigators refused to make assumptions. Genealogy could suggest. It could never convict. Scientific confirmation remained essential. The next stage required traditional detective work. Surveillance began discreetly. Officers observed McCurley's daily routine, where he went, who he met, how he moved through ordinary life. The objective remained simple: obtain a legally discarded DNA sample without alerting him to the investigation. Experienced detectives understood the importance of secrecy. If McCurley realized he had become the focus of renewed attention, he might destroy evidence, alter his behavior, or complicate the investigation. Patience remained their greatest advantage. Eventually, opportunity arrived. Investigators recovered an item McCurley had discarded in public. The object itself seemed insignificant. What mattered was the biological material it carried. The sample traveled immediately to the laboratory. Scientists already possessed the unknown DNA profile preserved from Carla Walker's murder. Now they had something to compare it against. Inside the laboratory, decades of waiting approached their conclusion. Technicians followed strict forensic protocols. Every step underwent careful documentation. Contamination safeguards remained absolute. Chain of custody was maintained with meticulous precision. No shortcuts. No assumptions. No room for error. The comparison began. Marker after marker aligned. Genetic sequences matched. The unknown offender from February 1974 and the modern reference sample pointed to the same individual. After nearly 48 years, the evidence finally identified the man who had left behind that microscopic trace during the murder of Carla Walker. For investigators who had spent careers pursuing unanswered questions, the moment felt almost unreal. Some detectives stared silently at the laboratory report before speaking. Others immediately began reviewing every piece of evidence collected throughout the decades. The DNA did not stand alone. It strengthened everything that had already been established: the timeline, the witness statements, the physical evidence, the behavioral profile. Suddenly, scattered fragments assembled into a coherent picture. The investigation that had survived generations now possessed a suspect supported by powerful forensic evidence. Yet detectives remained cautious. An arrest in a case nearly 50 years old demanded absolute certainty. Every report underwent renewed examination. Every procedural step received additional review. Prosecutors joined investigators to evaluate the evidence before moving forward. The legal burden remained exactly the same as it had been in 1974. Prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The passage of time changed nothing. It merely made precision even more important. While investigators prepared their case, they also reflected upon an extraordinary reality. The biological evidence collected in 1974 had outlived almost every other aspect of the investigation. Witness memories had faded. Businesses near the crime scene had disappeared. Roads had changed. Entire neighborhoods had transformed. Some original investigators had passed away. The evidence remained exactly where they had left it, waiting, patient, unchanged. Its value had increased because science finally understood its language. For Carla Walker's family, the phone call arrived after decades of uncertainty. Detectives informed them that the investigation had reached a remarkable breakthrough. A suspect had been identified. The words were almost impossible to process. For nearly half a century, hope had repeatedly risen before collapsing. Every promising lead eventually disappeared. Every new theory ended in disappointment. This felt different. This time investigators were speaking with quiet confidence rather than cautious optimism. Science had given them something previous generations never possessed: an identity. The emotional impact proved overwhelming. Relief mixed with grief. Joy collided with sorrow. Knowing the truth could never erase nearly 5 decades of absence. But uncertainty, the cruelest burden carried by families of unsolved homicide victims, was finally beginning to lift. Across Fort Worth, news of the breakthrough spread rapidly. Residents who remembered the original headlines struggled to believe the announcement. One of the city's oldest murder mysteries appeared to be reaching its conclusion. Younger generations, unfamiliar with the investigation, discovered the story for the first time. The case once again dominated local news. Not because another tragedy had occurred, because an old tragedy was finally speaking. Reporters revisited the timeline. The Valentine's dance. The parking lot. Rodney McCoy's desperate struggle. The abandoned investigation that had never truly been abandoned. Most importantly, they highlighted the astonishing role of forensic science. A microscopic biological trace preserved since 1974 had survived long enough to expose the man who believed history had erased his crime. The public reaction reflected more than curiosity. It reflected changing expectations. For decades, people assumed cold cases inevitably faded into history. The Walker investigation challenged that belief completely. If one murder nearly half a century old could be solved through modern forensic techniques, how many others remained waiting? Evidence rooms across the country suddenly looked different. Boxes collecting dust no longer represented forgotten failures. They represented possibilities. The Walker case became part of a larger movement reshaping homicide investigations throughout the United States. Cold case units expanded. DNA laboratories received additional funding. Genealogical investigations accelerated nationwide. Every successful prosecution strengthened confidence that more answers remained hidden inside preserved evidence. Yet amid the celebration surrounding the breakthrough, investigators never lost sight of the human reality beneath the headlines. This was never simply about scientific achievement. It was about an 18-year-old whose life ended violently before adulthood had truly begun. It was about a family forced to wait almost 50 years for answers. It was about a young man who spent decades replaying one horrifying night, wondering whether he could somehow have changed the outcome. Science had identified a suspect. The legal process still lay ahead. And after 48 years of silence, the investigation was preparing for the most important confrontation in its history. The moment when the evidence that had waited so patiently would finally speak inside a courtroom, where time itself would no longer protect the man who had believed he escaped justice forever. The announcement that investigators had identified a suspect nearly half a century after Carla Walker's murder sent shockwaves through Texas. For decades, the case had existed as one of Fort Worth's deepest wounds, a crime so brazen and so brutal that many believed it would remain unsolved forever. Suddenly, the impossible appeared within reach. But detectives understood something the public often overlooked. Identifying a suspect was not the same as proving guilt in court. After 48 years, every decision carried extraordinary weight. Memories had faded. Witnesses had grown older. Some had died. Physical locations had changed beyond recognition. The investigation now entered its most delicate phase. One mistake could destroy decades of patient work. The evidence had survived nearly half a century. Now it had to survive the courtroom. Inside the Fort Worth Police Department, preparations intensified. Boxes that had remained sealed for years were opened once again. Investigators carefully reviewed every interview, every photograph, every laboratory report, every handwritten note left behind by detectives long since retired. Nothing could be overlooked. Prosecutors approached the case with exceptional caution. A murder prosecution built almost 5 decades after the crime demanded extraordinary preparation. The defense would almost certainly challenge everything. The age of the evidence, the reliability of memories, the chain of custody, the evolution of forensic science itself. Every possible weakness had to be anticipated long before the trial began. Detectives welcomed the scrutiny. They had spent years ensuring the evidence could withstand exactly those questions. The DNA match remained the cornerstone of the investigation. Laboratory experts independently verified the results. Additional testing confirmed the original findings. There could be no uncertainty. The biological evidence recovered in 1974 matched the DNA obtained from Glenn Samuel McCurley. The scientific conclusion remained consistent. The unknown man who left that biological material during Carla Walker's murder had finally been identified. But science alone rarely tells an entire story. Investigators continued reconstructing McCurley's life during the early 1970s. Where had he lived? What vehicles had he owned? Did he have connections to the areas surrounding the abduction and murder? Did his movements align with known facts? Slowly, additional pieces began falling into place. Records placed him in North Texas during the period. His age matched the estimated age of the attacker described decades earlier. His history revealed behavior investigators considered significant. None of those details independently proved guilt. Together with the DNA evidence, however, they strengthened an already compelling case. The Walker family faced emotions difficult to describe. For nearly 5 decades, they had imagined countless possibilities. Perhaps the killer had died. Perhaps he had left the country. Perhaps they would never know his name. Now detectives were telling them something entirely different. The man responsible had lived an ordinary life. He had grown older while Carla never had the opportunity. He experienced birthdays she would never celebrate. He watched children become adults while Carla remained forever 18. That reality struck with painful force. Justice delayed carries its own unique form of grief. It restores truth. It cannot restore time. Rodney McCoy also learned of the breakthrough. Nearly half a century had passed since the attack that changed his life forever. He had carried memories impossible to erase. The sounds, the struggle, the helplessness, the overwhelming guilt that accompanies survival. Friends had reassured him countless times that nothing more could have been done. Logic offered little comfort. Trauma rarely obeys logic. Now, after decades of uncertainty, investigators finally possessed the identity of the man who had shattered 2 young lives in a matter of minutes. For Rodney, the announcement represented something larger than an arrest. It represented validation. He had told the truth from the very beginning. The investigation had never failed because of his testimony. It had simply required science that did not yet exist. As news spread across the country, forensic experts pointed to the Walker investigation as another milestone in the growing success of investigative genetic genealogy. Only a few years earlier, many law enforcement agencies viewed the technique cautiously. Now it had solved another infamous cold case. The message became impossible to ignore. Evidence once considered insufficient had acquired entirely new meaning. Old investigations deserved another look. Families waiting decades for answers suddenly found renewed hope. Every successful prosecution expanded the possibilities for hundreds of other unsolved murders. Meanwhile, detectives continued building the strongest possible legal case. They revisited the original crime scenes, compared historical photographs with modern locations, consulted surviving witnesses, verified timelines. Even seemingly minor details underwent renewed examination. Experience had taught them an important lesson. Old cases often hinge upon overlooked facts. A forgotten document, an overlooked interview, a seemingly insignificant observation recorded decades earlier. Nothing could be dismissed. One challenge remained unavoidable. Time changes memory. Witnesses who had once recalled details clearly now struggled to remember conversations from nearly 50 years earlier. Some descriptions differed slightly from original statements. Others admitted openly that certain memories had faded. Prosecutors expected that. Human memory naturally changes with time. Fortunately, the investigation no longer depended solely upon recollection. The DNA evidence provided something memory could never offer: objective identification. It did not forget. It did not become uncertain. It remained exactly the same as the night the crime occurred. That permanence became the investigation's greatest strength. Investigators also reflected upon the extraordinary foresight of those who handled the original evidence in 1974. Without their meticulous preservation, none of this would have been possible. Every properly sealed package, every documented transfer, every carefully labeled envelope. Those ordinary procedural decisions ultimately defeated nearly half a century of silence. The detectives who first responded to Carlos' murder never witnessed the scientific breakthrough that solved the case. Many had retired long before. Some had passed away. Yet their work remained present in every piece of preserved evidence. Justice became a shared accomplishment spanning generations. The arrest itself attracted enormous media attention. Television cameras gathered outside police facilities. Reporters repeated a sentence few people ever expected to hear. An arrest had been made in the murder of Carla Walker. For younger viewers, it sounded like another criminal case. For those who remembered 1974, it felt almost unbelievable. The mystery that had haunted Fort Worth for nearly 5 decades finally had a face. Questions immediately followed. Why had it taken so long? How had investigators identified him? Could other cold cases be solved the same way? Law enforcement officials answered carefully. The investigation succeeded because evidence had been preserved and science had advanced. Neither factor alone would have been enough. Together, they changed history. Across the nation, families with unsolved homicide cases watched the news closely. Some recognized their own experiences reflected in the Walker investigation. Years without answers. Promises from detectives. Hope fading with each passing anniversary. The case reminded them that silence does not necessarily mean failure. Sometimes silence simply means the evidence is waiting for the future. For Glenn Samuel McCurley, however, the future had finally arrived. The confidence built over decades suddenly collapsed beneath a laboratory report. The microscopic biological trace left behind in 1974 had survived every birthday, every holiday, every passing year. It had remained hidden while he believed the investigation had ended. Now it stood ready to confront him in a courtroom. After 48 years, the smallest piece of evidence had become the loudest witness of all. And for the first time since a frightened 18-year-old couple sat together in a quiet parking lot after a Valentine's dance, the path toward justice was no longer hidden in darkness. It was illuminated by science, preserved by patience, and carried forward by generations of investigators who had refused to let one young woman's voice disappear into history. When a murder investigation stretches across nearly half a century, the courtroom becomes more than a place of legal judgment. It becomes a collision between two different eras. On one side stand memories from another generation, preserved in fading photographs, handwritten reports, and aging witnesses. On the other stands modern forensic science, capable of extracting answers from evidence collected long before anyone imagined such technology could exist. The murder of Carla Walker was about to become exactly that kind of collision. Nearly 48 years had passed since the night she disappeared from a parking lot in Fort Worth. The world had changed beyond recognition. The evidence had not. After Glenn Samuel McCurley was arrested, investigators understood that their work had entered its most demanding stage. The headlines announcing the arrest were only the beginning. Now every decision made over decades would face the closest possible examination. Defense attorneys would scrutinize every document, every laboratory procedure, every interview, every transfer of evidence, every scientific conclusion. Nothing would escape challenge. That is precisely how the justice system is designed to function. The older the case, the greater the need for careful scrutiny. Prosecutors welcomed that responsibility. They believed the evidence could withstand it. The DNA profile remained the centerpiece of the case. Experts prepared to explain not only the match itself but also the science behind it. Jurors would need to understand how biological evidence collected in 1974 could identify someone nearly 5 decades later. The explanation required patience. DNA does not age in the same way human memory does. If preserved correctly, genetic material remains remarkably stable. The scientific methods used to analyze it had changed dramatically. The evidence itself had not. That distinction became essential. Investigators had not created new evidence. They had simply unlocked information that had always been hidden within the original sample. The prosecution also relied on the extraordinary care shown by the original investigators. Every movement of the evidence had been documented, every laboratory examination recorded, every storage location preserved through an uninterrupted chain of custody. Those routine administrative procedures suddenly carried enormous significance. Without them, the defense could argue that contamination or mishandling had compromised the evidence. Instead, the records demonstrated decades of professional discipline. The biological sample remained exactly what investigators had collected in February 1974. Nothing more, nothing less. Behind the scenes, detectives revisited the original case one final time. They reviewed Rodney McCoy's statements from the night of the attack. What struck many younger investigators was their consistency. Despite unimaginable trauma, Rodney's account had remained remarkably stable across decades. He never exaggerated. He never attempted to fill gaps in memory with speculation. He described only what he had actually experienced: the sudden appearance of the armed stranger, the violent assault, the desperate struggle, the abduction. His honesty strengthened rather than weakened the investigation. He acknowledged what he did not know. That credibility mattered enormously. Investigators also examined Glenn McCurley's background more closely. Although the DNA evidence identified him as the source of the biological material recovered during the investigation, detectives wanted to understand the man behind the profile. Neighbors described him as quiet. Some acquaintances barely remembered him. Others recalled nothing unusual at all. That pattern has appeared repeatedly throughout criminal history. Many violent offenders do not resemble the monsters imagined by the public. They often live outwardly ordinary lives. They work, pay bills, attend family gatherings, appear polite. Routine becomes camouflage. The contrast unsettled many people following the case. How could someone allegedly responsible for such a horrific crime remain hidden for decades in plain sight? The answer lay not in extraordinary deception, but in ordinary invisibility. Thousands of people pass through communities every day without attracting attention. Most deserve that anonymity. A very small number abuse it. For Carlo Walker's family, preparations for trial reopened wounds that had never truly healed. Boxes of photographs returned. Old newspaper clippings resurfaced. Personal belongings carefully preserved through decades suddenly became part of legal proceedings. Every memory carried emotional weight. The trial would not simply revisit evidence. It would revisit loss. Family members understood that the courtroom could never restore what had been taken. Their hopes centered elsewhere: truth, accountability, recognition that Carla's life mattered enough for investigators to continue searching for nearly 50 years. Across Texas, public interest intensified. Many residents who remembered the original investigation followed every update. Others encountered the story for the first time. The case quickly became an example cited by law enforcement agencies discussing advances in forensic science. Detectives from other jurisdictions contacted Fort Worth investigators. Cold case units wanted to understand every stage of the investigation: evidence preservation, DNA testing, genealogical analysis, surveillance, confirmation. The Walker investigation became more than one solved murder. It became a blueprint. Meanwhile, prosecutors organized an enormous volume of evidence. The challenge extended beyond proving identity. They needed to explain the entire investigative journey clearly enough for jurors to understand. Why had the arrest taken 48 years? Why had earlier detectives failed to identify McCurley? What changed? The answers highlighted the extraordinary evolution of forensic science. The biological evidence always existed. Technology capable of interpreting it did not. That simple explanation carried enormous power. Justice had not failed. Science had finally caught up with the evidence. The defense prepared its own strategy. In any criminal trial, especially one involving decades-old evidence, defense attorneys have an obligation to challenge the prosecution's conclusions. Questions concerning memory, time, forensic interpretation, investigative procedures. Such challenges are fundamental to ensuring a fair trial. The prosecution anticipated everyone. Experts stood ready to explain laboratory protocols. Genealogists prepared to describe how family tree research guided investigators toward McCurley before the DNA comparison confirmed his identity. Experienced detectives would testify about preserving the evidence across generations. Each witness represented another link connecting 1974 to the present. One remarkable aspect of the case continued attracting attention from forensic professionals worldwide. The biological sample collected after Carla's murder had remained useful despite nearly half a century of storage. That outcome reinforced an increasingly important principle within law enforcement: never underestimate preserved evidence. Investigators cannot predict tomorrow's scientific capabilities. Evidence collected today may answer questions impossible to ask for decades. The Walker case illustrated that lesson with extraordinary clarity. Inside evidence rooms across America, technicians reviewed storage procedures with renewed appreciation. What seemed routine could someday become historic. Rodney McCoy quietly prepared himself for testimony. Nearly 50 years had passed since he last saw Carla alive. The memories remained vivid in ways he wished they did not. Drama has its own relationship with time. Some details fade. Others remain frozen forever. He remembered the gun, the blows to his head, Carla's screams, the helpless feeling as the attacker drove away. No passage of years could erase those moments. The opportunity to testify represented something he had waited almost his entire adult life to receive. Not revenge, not closure, simply the chance to tell the truth before a court finally listening with all the evidence that had once been missing. As the trial approached, one thought echoed repeatedly among investigators. The killer had relied upon the limitations of 1974. He had calculated risk according to the science of his own time. He could not anticipate DNA profiling. He could not foresee investigative genetic genealogy. He could not imagine that a microscopic trace left behind during a violent crime would survive long enough to identify him almost 50 years later. That miscalculation became the investigation's turning point. Not because he became less careful, because the future became far more capable than he ever imagined. The evidence had waited in silence through changing governments, changing technologies, and changing generations. Now at last, it was preparing to speak in the only place where its voice truly mattered: a courtroom, under oath, before a jury, where nearly 5 decades of unanswered questions would finally confront the man who believed time had erased every trace of the night he stole Carla Walker's future. The courtroom was quiet long before the proceedings began. Reporters filled the gallery. Members of Carla Walker's family sat together, carrying nearly 5 decades of grief into a room where they hoped, at last, the silence would end. Across the aisle sat the man investigators believed had escaped justice since 1974. Time had transformed everyone inside that courtroom. Teenagers had become grandparents. Young detectives had retired. Witnesses had grown old. Buildings had disappeared. Entire neighborhoods had changed. Yet one thing remained exactly as it had been on the night Carla Walker was murdered: the evidence. Preserved with extraordinary care, it had survived every passing year, waiting for the moment when science could finally reveal the identity hidden inside it. The prosecution opened its case with a simple but powerful message. This investigation had never stopped. It had evolved. The attorneys walked the jury back to the winter evening of February 17th, still 1974. The Valentine's dance. The bowling alley parking lot. Two young people sitting inside a car, believing they were completely safe. Then came the violent interruption. An armed stranger. A desperate struggle. A terrified abduction. A murder that left a city searching for answers for almost half a century. Jurors listened as investigators reconstructed the timeline minute by minute. The prosecution carefully avoided sensationalism. The facts themselves carried enough emotional weight. Rodney McCoy became one of the first key witnesses. He entered the courtroom carrying memories older than many of the people watching the trial. His testimony remained calm, measured, deliberate. He described the evening exactly as he had described it decades earlier. The conversation with Carla, the sudden appearance of the gunman, the blows delivered with the handgun, the confusion, the helplessness, the sound of the vehicle disappearing into the darkness. At several moments, emotion interrupted his voice. Not because his memory had weakened, because it had never left him. The prosecutor asked whether he had ever forgotten that night. Rodney answered quietly, "Not for a single day." His testimony reminded everyone inside the courtroom that cold cases do not freeze the lives of victims alone. Survivors continue living with those moments year after year. Defense attorneys questioned Rodney carefully. As expected, they explored the passage of time. Could he still remember every detail accurately after nearly 50 years? Were there things he no longer recalled? Rodney answered honestly. Some details had faded. Others remained permanently etched into memory. He refused to guess when he was uncertain. That honesty strengthened rather than weakened his credibility. Jurors often recognized the difference between genuine memory and exaggerated certainty. Rodney never pretended to know more than he did. Next came the investigators. Some had worked the original case. Others had inherited it decades later. Together they told the story of an investigation spanning generations. Boxes of evidence preserved through changing administrations. Files transferred from one detective to another. Promises made repeatedly that the Walker family would never be forgotten. The courtroom began to understand something remarkable. The prosecution was not presenting the work of one investigator. It was presenting the work of nearly 50 years. Then the scientific testimony began. Forensic experts explained how biological evidence had been collected in 1974. Jurors learned about preservation methods, storage procedures, chain of custody. The attorneys displayed evidence logs documenting every transfer of the samples. Nothing had disappeared. Nothing had been altered. Every movement had been recorded with meticulous precision. The defense listened carefully. Any break in that chain could undermine the prosecution's case. None appeared. Laboratory scientists then introduced the DNA evidence. The explanations were technical but carefully translated into language ordinary jurors could understand. DNA is inherited, unique, remarkably stable. The biological material collected during the investigation contained a genetic profile belonging to the offender. Modern forensic methods extracted that profile with extraordinary accuracy. Investigative genetic genealogy identified possible family connections. Traditional detective work narrowed those possibilities. Finally, a legally obtained reference sample from Glenn Samuel McCurley confirmed the match. The laboratory conclusion was direct. The DNA profiles matched. The probability of another unrelated individual sharing that same profile was astronomically small. The evidence did not suggest. It identified. Defense attorneys cross-examined the experts thoroughly. They questioned laboratory procedures, potential contamination, statistical interpretation, scientific limitations. The experts remained composed. Every procedure had followed accepted forensic standards. Independent reviews confirmed the findings. Quality control measures had been documented at every stage. The evidence withstood the questioning. Jurors watched carefully. Many later observers remarked upon the extraordinary contrast between old and new. Handwritten reports from 1974 sat beside sophisticated genetic analysis from the 21st century. Two completely different eras had joined forces inside one investigation. The prosecution next introduced photographs from the original crime scenes. The images were difficult to view. They reminded everyone that behind every scientific discussion stood a young woman whose future had ended violently. Carla's smiling school photographs appeared beside evidence collected after her death. The contrast was devastating. She had been 18, preparing for adulthood, thinking about college, work, family, and dreams still waiting ahead. Everything ended within minutes because one violent stranger crossed her path. Witnesses described the impact of the crime upon Fort Worth. Fear spread rapidly after the murder. Parents changed routines. Teenagers abandoned familiar gathering places. Residents who once considered their neighborhoods safe suddenly looked over their shoulders. The case became part of the city's identity, not because people wanted to remember it, because they could not forget it. The prosecution emphasized another important point. The investigation had never depended solely upon DNA. The genetic evidence identified the suspect. The surrounding facts supported the conclusion. McCurley lived in the region. His age aligned with witness descriptions. The physical evidence connected him to the crime. The timeline remained consistent. Every piece reinforced the others, like individual threads woven together into a single unbroken fabric. Outside the courthouse, media attention intensified with every passing day. Television crews broadcast live updates. Newspapers revisited archive photographs from 1974. Journalists interviewed retired detectives who had once feared they would never see an arrest. Many admitted openly that they never expected to witness the case resolved during their lifetimes. Yet here they were, watching science complete work that determination alone could not. For Carla's family, each day inside the courtroom reopened decades of grief. They listened once again to descriptions of the crime, reviewed evidence they wished had never existed, relived moments they had spent years trying to survive. Still, they attended every session. Not because it was easy, because Carla deserved witnesses. She deserved people who would remain present until the truth was spoken completely. The trial had become more than a legal proceeding. It had become a final act of remembrance. As testimony continued, one reality became increasingly clear. The investigation succeeded because no generation of detectives allowed the case to disappear. The original investigators preserved evidence. Successive detectives protected it. Modern forensic scientists unlocked it. Each generation accomplished something the others could not. Separated by decades. United by purpose. The killer believed he had escaped because no one knew his name. What he never understood was that evidence has extraordinary patience. It asks for nothing except time. And after waiting nearly half a century, it had finally found its voice in a courtroom where every word carried the weight of 48 years of unanswered questions, bringing the long, silent pursuit of justice closer than it had ever been before. As the trial entered its next phase, the atmosphere inside the courtroom changed. The emotional testimony had reminded everyone why the investigation mattered. Now came the evidence that would determine whether nearly 5 decades of detective work would end in conviction or disappointment. Every exhibit placed before the jury represented years of persistence. Every witness carried part of a story that stretched across generations. The prosecution no longer needed to explain why the case had remained unsolved for so long. Instead, they needed to prove that despite the passage of 48 years, the truth had remained intact. The defense, meanwhile, faced a daunting challenge. They could not erase the DNA. They could only attempt to create enough uncertainty to prevent the jury from reaching one conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt. Forensic scientists returned to the witness stand. This time, the focus shifted from discovery to certainty. Laboratory specialists explained exactly how the DNA profile had been developed. Jurors learned that modern forensic analysis follows strict international standards. Every sample is examined multiple times. Every conclusion is independently reviewed. Every significant finding is documented. Science depends upon repetition. If the same result appears consistently, confidence grows. If results conflict, Investigators searched for the reason before reaching any conclusion. In Carla Walker's case, the findings remained consistent from beginning to end. The biological evidence preserved from 1974 belonged to the same individual whose reference DNA investigators obtained decades later. The defense questioned whether contamination could have occurred. The expert answered calmly. The chain of custody showed continuous control of the evidence. Laboratory procedures included contamination safeguards. Independent quality checks confirmed the integrity of the testing. No indication suggested that outside DNA had entered the sample. The biological material remained authentic. The jury listened attentively. Many had little scientific background. The experts therefore avoided unnecessary technical language. Instead, they explained concepts through simple comparisons. DNA functions like an extraordinarily detailed biological signature. Unlike eyewitness memory, it does not become less reliable simply because years have passed. If preserved properly, it continues identifying its source regardless of whether days or decades separate collection from analysis. That explanation resonated throughout the courtroom. Time had changed people. It had not changed the DNA. The prosecution then turned to investigative genetic genealogy. For many jurors, it was the first time they had heard the term. Experts described the process carefully. Investigators did not search directly for the offender. They searched for relatives who had voluntarily contributed genetic information to public genealogy databases. Those distant relationships allowed genealogists to build extensive family trees. The trees gradually narrowed toward individuals matching the known facts of the investigation. Only after traditional detective work identified a viable suspect did investigators obtain a separate DNA sample for direct comparison. Genealogy pointed the direction. A forensic DNA confirmed the destination. The distinction proved important. A defense suggested genealogy represented speculation. The experts disagreed. Genealogy generated investigative leads. The arrest relied upon laboratory confirmation. No one had been charged because of family history alone. The charge resulted from scientific identification supported by decades of preserved evidence. Jurors began seeing how every stage connected logically to the next. The prosecution next introduced testimony concerning evidence preservation. Retired officers described procedures followed in 1974. Although forensic science has advanced dramatically since then, many fundamental investigative principles remain unchanged. Collect carefully. Label accurately. Protect the evidence. Document every transfer. Those principles had preserved Carla Walker's case through generations. One retired detective admitted he never imagined DNA technology would one day identify the offender. He simply believed future investigators deserved the opportunity to examine the evidence using whatever methods became available. That decision, made without knowledge of future science, became one of the investigation's defining moments. The courtroom grew noticeably quiet. It was a reminder that justice often depends upon people preparing for a future they will never personally witness. Outside the courthouse, discussions spread nationwide. Cold case investigators followed the proceedings closely. Law enforcement agencies recognized the significance of the case. This was not merely another prosecution. It represented proof that evidence collected nearly half a century earlier could survive legal scrutiny through modern scientific analysis. Many departments began reviewing their own cold case evidence storage procedures. The Walker investigation reinforced a lesson already becoming increasingly clear. Preserve everything. No investigator can predict what tomorrow's science will accomplish. Meanwhile, the prosecution revisited Rodney McCoy's testimony through additional witnesses. Medical records documented the injuries he suffered during the attack. Photographs taken shortly afterward showed the severity of the blows delivered by the armed assailant. The evidence confirmed Rodney's account. He had not surrendered willingly. He had fought desperately. The violence inflicted upon him reflected the determination of an offender focused entirely on completing the abduction. That detail supported the prosecution's broader argument. The attack had been swift, controlled, deliberate, and not the actions of someone acting in sudden panic. Behavioral evidence also entered the discussion. Experts explained that offenders who commit stranger abductions often display confidence developed through planning or previous criminal conduct. While behavioral analysis cannot identify an individual by itself, it helps investigators understand how the crime unfolded. In Carla Walker's case, the offender demonstrated remarkable control from the first seconds of the confrontation. He approached without hesitation, neutralized Rodney through overwhelming violence, forced Carla into the vehicle, escaped before police arrived. The sequence reflected purpose rather than improvisation. The defense challenged portions of that interpretation, reminding jurors that behavioral opinions should never replace direct evidence. The prosecution agreed. Behavior alone proves nothing. The DNA, however, provided direct identification. Behavior simply helped explain the events surrounding the crime. Throughout the proceedings, Carla's family remained composed. Their presence never sought sympathy. It represented endurance. 48 years of waiting had brought them to this courtroom. Many people observing the trial commented upon their quiet dignity. They listened without interruption. They watched every witness. They carried photographs of Carla as she had been before one night changed everything. An 18-year-old with plans, dreams, ordinary hopes that violence abruptly erased. One prosecutor later remarked that the trial never allowed anyone to forget the human being at its center. Scientific evidence identified the offender. Carla Walker remained the reason the evidence mattered. As the prosecution prepared to conclude its case, investigators reflected privately upon the extraordinary journey. Detectives who began their careers after the murder had eventually solved it. Scientists born years after Carla died had analyzed evidence collected before they entered the world. Generations separated by time had unknowingly collaborated toward one objective: justice. The investigation had become larger than any single detective, prosecutor, or forensic expert. It represented institutional memory, professional discipline, scientific progress, and above all, an unwavering refusal to accept that 48 years of silence should become permanent. The defense would soon present its own arguments, urging jurors to question whether the passage of time had created uncertainties impossible to overcome. But beneath every legal argument remained one undeniable reality. The microscopic trace collected in 1974 had survived unchanged through decades of history. It had waited patiently while technology evolved. Now it stood before 12 jurors, asking only one question. Would they believe what the evidence had been trying to say since the night Carla Walker's future was stolen forever? By the time the defense began presenting its case, nearly half a century of history had already unfolded inside the courtroom. Jurors had traveled back to February 1974 through photographs, testimony, investigative reports, and scientific analysis. They had watched generations of detectives describe the same relentless pursuit. They had listened as forensic experts explained how a microscopic biological trace survived long enough to identify the man who allegedly believed his crime would never be connected to him. Now the defense faced an enormous challenge. They did not need to explain the tragedy. They did not need to dispute that Carla Walker had been abducted, assaulted, and murdered. Their responsibility was narrower, but equally important. They needed to convince the jury that the prosecution had failed to eliminate reasonable doubt. After 48 years, even the smallest uncertainty could influence the outcome. The defense began by emphasizing the passage of time. Nearly 5 decades had separated the crime from the trial. Witnesses had aged. Memories had faded. Some investigators who worked the original case were no longer alive to testify. Documents reflected investigative standards from another era. The defense argued that such extraordinary delays naturally create challenges for any criminal prosecution. Jurors listened carefully. Time had become an invisible participant in the trial. It had changed every person involved. It had not changed the evidence. Defense attorneys questioned several witnesses about specific details from the original investigation. Why had certain suspects been examined more closely than others? Were all leads pursued equally? Could assumptions made decades earlier have influenced later decisions? Experienced detectives answered directly. Investigations evolve as new information becomes available. Every credible lead had been examined. Every significant suspect had been investigated. No evidence connected those individuals to the crime strongly enough to justify prosecution. The Walker investigation had remained open precisely because investigators refused to settle for speculation. The defense also examined the role of investigative genetic genealogy. Although the technique had gained increasing acceptance within law enforcement, defense attorneys reminded jurors that genealogy itself does not establish guilt. Experts from both sides agreed on that point. Genealogy identifies investigative possibilities. A decisive evidence comes from the direct DNA comparison. That distinction ultimately favored the prosecution. Once the genealogy narrowed investigators toward Glenn Samuel McCurley, the laboratory comparison independently confirmed the biological match. The DNA did not rely upon family trees. It relied upon genetics. The prosecution reinforced that point repeatedly during redirect examination. One of the most closely watched moments occurred when forensic experts returned to discuss statistical certainty. Jurors wanted understandable answers. How likely was it that someone else could share the same DNA profile? Experts explained that forensic DNA analysis examines multiple genetic markers simultaneously. The probability of an unrelated individual matching the complete profile was extraordinarily remote. Not impossible in an absolute philosophical sense, but scientifically so unlikely that the DNA identified one person to the exclusion of virtually everyone else. A courtroom remained silent as those numbers were explained. The defense questioned whether laboratory mistakes could occur. The experts answered honestly. Any scientific process involves the possibility of human error. That is precisely why modern laboratories require multiple reviews, independent verification, quality assurance procedures, and extensive documentation. The Walker evidence had passed through every required safeguard. No indication of laboratory error appeared anywhere in the record. Jurors watched the exchange closely. Confidence often grows when experts openly acknowledge limitations rather than claiming perfection. The prosecution next returned attention to Carla herself. Friends and relatives described the young woman they remembered before tragedy overtook her life. She loved spending time with family. She enjoyed ordinary teenage experiences. She looked toward adulthood with optimism. These witnesses did not speculate about the crime. They reminded the courtroom why the investigation mattered. Behind every laboratory report stood a real human life interrupted forever. Many observers later remarked that these testimonies transformed Carla from a name in an old newspaper into a vivid presence inside the courtroom. The defense chose not to challenge those memories. Instead, they focused upon legal standards. Sympathy, they reminded jurors, cannot replace proof. The prosecution agreed. The verdict must rest upon evidence alone. That agreement reflected one of the trial's defining characteristics. Despite its emotional weight, both sides consistently returned to facts. Facts preserved across nearly half a century. Outside the courtroom, national media continued covering the proceedings. Forensic scientists, legal scholars, and homicide investigators discussed the case extensively. Many viewed it as a landmark demonstration of modern cold case investigation. Universities incorporated aspects of the investigation into forensic education. Law enforcement conferences examined the preservation methods that allowed biological evidence to survive so many years. The Walker case had become both a criminal prosecution and an educational milestone. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors carefully assembled every remaining piece of their argument. They reminded jurors that the investigation contained no shortcuts, no rushed conclusions, no reliance upon a single piece of evidence. The biological sample collected in 1974, the uninterrupted chain of custody, the DNA profile, the genealogical research, the independent confirmation through a discarded reference sample, a historical investigation, the consistency of witness accounts. Each component supported the others. Like stones forming an arch, removing one would weaken the structure. Together they created extraordinary strength. One veteran detective offered testimony that resonated deeply with many people following the case. He explained that cold case investigators never truly expect gratitude. Most understand they may retire before seeing justice achieved. Their responsibility is simpler. Protect the evidence. Preserve the truth. Prepare the case for whoever comes next. His words reflected the remarkable continuity behind the Walker investigation. No single detective solved the case. Generations solved it together. The defense concluded by asking jurors to remember the extraordinary burden placed upon criminal trials. Reasonable doubt exists to protect against wrongful convictions. That principle remains essential regardless of public opinion or emotional reaction. The prosecution agreed with the principle. Their disagreement concerned the evidence. They argued that the evidence left no reasonable doubt to consider. As both sides prepared for closing arguments, the atmosphere inside the courtroom became noticeably heavier. Everyone understood what approached. After nearly 48 years, 12 jurors would soon determine whether one of Texas's oldest unsolved murders had finally reached its legal conclusion. If for Carla Walker's family, the wait felt strangely familiar. Waiting had defined their lives since 1974. Waiting for investigators. Waiting for laboratory results. Waiting for scientific breakthroughs. Waiting for an arrest. Now they waited once more, this time for a verdict. For Glenn Samuel McCurley, decades of anonymity had ended. The ordinary life he believed had permanently separated him from one violent night was now being examined through the lens of preserved evidence and modern science. Time had once seemed his greatest ally. Now it stood as the prosecution's strongest witness. Because every passing year had allowed science to grow more powerful, while the biological trace he left behind remained exactly where investigators had found it. Silent. Patient. Unchanged. Waiting for 12 citizens to decide whether 48 years of silence would finally give way to justice. Closing arguments are unlike any other moment in a criminal trial. The witnesses have spoken. The forensic experts have explained their findings. Every photograph, report, and exhibit has been placed before the jury. Nothing new remains to be introduced. What remains is interpretation. Two competing narratives now stand before 12 ordinary citizens, each asking to be believed. In the murder of Carla Walker, those final arguments carried the weight of nearly half a century. 48 years of unanswered questions had been reduced to one courtroom, one deliberation room, and one decision that would determine whether decades of perseverance would end with justice or with another chapter of uncertainty. The prosecution stood before the jury without dramatic gestures. They did not need them. The facts carried enough power on their own. They began by returning to the night of February 17, SIL, 1974. An ordinary Sunday evening. A young couple celebrating Valentine's weekend. A quiet parking lot. A stranger appearing without warning. Violence erupting in seconds. An 18-year-old woman disappearing into the darkness. The prosecutor reminded jurors that every investigation begins with uncertainty. This one had begun with almost none of the tools modern detectives now consider routine. There were no surveillance cameras, no cellular telephone records, no digital footprints, no DNA databases. Only determined investigators collecting every possible piece of evidence before time could erase it. Those investigators had done exactly what their training demanded. They preserved the evidence. They documented every observation. They refused to discard anything that might someday matter. At the time, they could not have known that one carefully preserved biological sample would eventually solve the case. Yet because of their discipline, that possibility remained alive. The prosecutor paused before displaying the evidence log once more. Every transfer, every storage location, every laboratory submission. Decades separated those entries. The chain remained unbroken. This evidence, the prosecutor explained, never stopped telling the truth. It simply waited until science became capable of hearing it. Jurors followed the timeline once again. The murder. Years of investigation. Countless interviews. Hundreds of leads. No arrest. Then scientific progress. DNA profiling. Improved forensic testing. Investigative genetic genealogy. The careful identification of Glenn Samuel McCurley. The collection of a legally obtained comparison sample. The laboratory confirmation. Every step built upon the previous one. Nothing appeared rushed. Nothing relied upon assumption. The prosecution emphasized that patience itself had strengthened the investigation. If detectives had forced an arrest decades earlier without sufficient evidence, justice might never have been achieved. Instead, they waited until science could provide certainty. The prosecutor then turned toward the defense's central argument. Yes, 48 years had passed. Yes, memories naturally fade. That reality actually increased the importance of physical evidence. Human recollection changes. DNA does not. Time weakens memory. It does not rewrite genetics. The biological material recovered during the original investigation remained exactly what it had always been. The only difference was humanity's ability to understand it. The prosecution concluded with Carla Walker herself. Not the evidence. And not the technology. The person. A smiling 18-year-old whose future disappeared in minutes. A daughter. A friend. Someone who never received the opportunity to build the life she imagined. Justice, they reminded the jury, could never restore her life. It could acknowledge the truth about how it ended. The defense approached the podium with equal composure. Their responsibility differed fundamentally. The law does not require defendants to prove innocence. The burden belongs entirely to the prosecution. Defense attorneys reminded jurors that this principle protects everyone. Emotion cannot replace evidence. Sympathy cannot substitute for proof. The defense urged jurors to examine every scientific conclusion carefully. Question every assumption. Remember the extraordinary length of time separating the crime from the trial. They argued that investigators naturally became convinced of their conclusion after years of pursuing the case. Jurors, however, must remain independent. The defense questioned whether any investigation conducted across nearly half a century could avoid every possibility of uncertainty. Witnesses had died. Locations had changed. Some original detectives could no longer testify. The prosecution's narrative depended heavily upon modern interpretation of old evidence. The defense suggested that jurors should examine those interpretations with caution. They did not deny the scientific significance of DNA. Instead, they challenged whether every surrounding conclusion necessarily followed from it. The legal standard remained unchanged. Beyond a reasonable doubt. If doubt remained reasonable, acquittal remained required. The courtroom fell silent once both sides finished speaking. The judge instructed the jury carefully. They must consider only the evidence presented during trial. Outside opinions. Media coverage. Public interest. None of those belonged inside deliberations. Only facts. Only law. Only evidence. The jurors filed quietly into the deliberation room. For the first time in nearly 48 years, the outcome no longer rested with detectives or scientists. It rested with 12 citizens. Inside police headquarters, investigators waited anxiously. Veteran detectives who had spent decades pursuing the case understood they could do nothing more. Every report had been written. Every witness examined. Every scientific test completed. Now the evidence belonged entirely to the jury. Some investigators reflected privately upon colleagues who had begun the case but never lived to witness this moment. Detectives who collected the original evidence. Crime scene technicians who sealed the biological samples. Supervisors who insisted everything be preserved. Their work remained present, even though they were not. For Carla Walker's family, the waiting felt painfully familiar. Nearly half a century had consisted of waiting. Waiting for phone calls. Waiting for laboratory breakthroughs. Waiting for investigators to discover something new. Now another wait began. Perhaps the final one. Family members sat together quietly. Conversation became unnecessary. Everyone understood the significance of the moment. Outside the courthouse, reporters remained stationed throughout the day. Television cameras stayed ready. Across Texas and beyond, people followed developments closely. Many cold case families recognized themselves in the Walker family's long journey. Some hoped this case might inspire renewed attention toward their own unanswered tragedies. Others simply wanted confirmation that justice remained possible regardless of time. Hours passed. No verdict. Jurors continued examining evidence, reviewing testimony, discussing scientific findings, requesting portions of witness statements. Every careful question reflected the seriousness of their task. No one wanted speed. They wanted certainty. As evening approached, investigators prepared for another day of waiting. Experience had taught them not to interpret the length of deliberations. Quick verdicts sometimes favor conviction, sometimes acquittal. Long deliberations can mean disagreement, or simply careful consideration. Speculation served no purpose. The evidence had spoken. Now 12 strangers had to decide whether it had spoken clearly enough. Across the courtroom, one thought quietly united nearly everyone involved. The murder of Carla Walker had already changed criminal investigations forever. Regardless of the verdict, it demonstrated that preserved evidence possesses extraordinary power. It showed that science can continue advancing long after offenders believe they have escaped. It reminded every detective handling today's evidence that tomorrow's technology may reveal answers unimaginable today. Still, one final question remained unanswered. Would the jury conclude that the microscopic biological trace preserved since 1974 had not only identified the man responsible, but had finally destroyed the illusion that nearly half a century of silence could ever? The investigation into the murder of Carla Walker ultimately became one of the longest-running homicide inquiries in Texas history. What began on a cold February morning in 1974 evolved into a case that would span nearly 5 decades, involve multiple generations of detectives, and eventually showcase the transformative power of modern forensic science. Although the initial investigation was extensive, investigators were constrained by the technology available at the time. Crime scene technicians carefully documented the location where Carla's body was discovered, photographed the evidence, collected biological material, preserved clothing, and searched for fingerprints, fibers, hairs, tire impressions, and footprints. Detectives interviewed Rodney McCoy in detail as soon as his medical condition allowed, documenting his account of the armed attacker who struck him, abducted Carla, and disappeared into the darkness within moments. His statement established the sequence of events and provided investigators with their first description of the offender. But the attack had unfolded so quickly and under such stressful conditions that only a limited physical description could be developed. During the weeks that followed, investigators launched an intensive regional search. Hundreds of interviews were conducted with local residents, business owners, and individuals who had been near the bowling alley or along possible escape routes on the night of the abduction. Officers reviewed reports involving similar crimes, questioned known violent offenders, and examined individuals with histories of kidnapping or sexual assault. Every promising lead received attention, yet none produced enough evidence to identify the killer. Detectives accumulated thousands of pages of reports, gradually assembling one of the largest homicide case files in the department's history. Despite their determination, the investigation eventually reached the limits of the forensic methods available during the mid-1970s. One decision made during those early stages would prove decisive decades later. Rather than discarding or minimizing biological evidence that could not yet be fully analyzed, investigators carefully preserved it. Laboratory personnel maintained strict chain of custody documentation, ensuring that every transfer, examination, and storage location was recorded. At the time, no one could predict that future advances in forensic science would make those preserved samples extraordinarily valuable. Nevertheless, the evidence remained securely stored as the years passed. The case never officially closed. Although active investigative leads became increasingly rare, detectives periodically reopened the file to review previous interviews, reassess potential suspects, and examine whether new forensic techniques could provide additional information. As experienced investigators retired, the responsibility for the case passed to younger detectives, each inheriting decades of investigative work completed by their predecessors. This continuity ensured that knowledge accumulated over many years was not lost. The development of DNA profiling during the 1980s and 1990s fundamentally changed homicide investigations throughout the United States. Detectives assigned to Carla Walker's case recognized the potential of this emerging technology and periodically re-evaluated the preserved biological evidence. As laboratory methods improved, the evidence yielded increasingly useful genetic information. Eventually, forensic scientists succeeded in developing a DNA profile suitable for advanced analysis. Even then, however, no direct match existed within traditional law enforcement DNA databases, meaning investigators still lacked the identity of the individual who had left the biological evidence behind. The breakthrough came through investigative genetic genealogy, an emerging investigative technique that combines forensic DNA analysis with genealogical research. Rather than searching only for exact matches in criminal databases, Investigators examined publicly available genealogy databases where individuals had voluntarily submitted DNA information for family history purposes. The unknown DNA profile did not identify the offender directly. Instead, it revealed distant biological relatives. Professional genealogists then constructed extensive family trees, tracing multiple generations through birth records, marriage records, census documents, military records, and other historical sources. This painstaking research gradually narrowed the number of possible individuals. Detectives combined the genealogical findings with traditional investigative methods, including age, geographic location, historical records, and other factual information, to identify viable candidates. Eventually, the investigation focused on Glenn Samuel McCurley, who had lived in North Texas during the relevant period. Importantly, genealogical research alone did not establish criminal responsibility. It merely generated an investigative lead. Detectives therefore initiated discreet surveillance to obtain a legally permissible reference DNA sample from an item McCurley had discarded in public. The recovered biological material was submitted for laboratory comparison against the DNA profile developed from evidence collected during the 1974 homicide investigation. The results provided the critical breakthrough investigators had pursued for nearly 48 years. According to forensic analysis, the DNA obtained from the discarded sample matched the DNA profile generated from the preserved evidence collected during the investigation into Carla Walker's murder. This comparison transformed the investigation from a decades-old mystery into an identified suspect supported by modern forensic evidence. Following extensive review by investigators and prosecutors, authorities arrested Glenn Samuel McCurley in 2020. The announcement represented a milestone not only for Carla Walker's family, but also for the many detectives, forensic scientists, crime scene personnel, laboratory analysts, and genealogists whose work had contributed to the investigation across nearly 5 decades. The Walker investigation has since become an important example within law enforcement of several enduring investigative principles. First, meticulous evidence preservation can prove invaluable even when contemporary technology cannot fully analyze collected material. Second, maintaining comprehensive documentation and chain of custody ensures that evidence remains admissible and reliable decades later. Third, successful cold case investigations often depend upon collaboration between traditional detective work and continually evolving forensic science. Today, the investigation is widely studied as a landmark example of how advances in DNA technology and investigative genetic genealogy have transformed the ability of law enforcement agencies to solve long unsolved homicides. It demonstrates that while time may complicate an investigation by fading memories and reducing available witnesses, carefully preserved physical evidence can retain its evidentiary value for generations. The case also illustrates the persistence required of investigators who continue reviewing evidence long after public attention has faded, recognizing that future scientific developments may one day provide answers that were impossible to obtain when the crime was first committed. The resolution of the Carla Walker murder investigation marked far more than the identification of a suspect in a decades-old homicide. It became a defining example of how modern forensic science